Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to try to wrap up the Renaissance, and we've talked a lot about the Renaissance in the past week or so. We looked at why the Renaissance started in Italy. We looked at what the Renaissance was and certainly what it meant. We talked about four Renaissance painters and sculptors with Michelangelo and Donatello and Raphael and Da Vinci. We even looked at the Northern Renaissance. We looked at Albrecht Dürer, and we saw the building of the printing press. We've seen a lot of great things come out of the Renaissance. One thing we haven't spoken a lot about is Renaissance writers. I mean, we made a little bit of a connection to Shakespeare in our Northern Renaissance roundtable, but here we want to focus on some very important writers that come out of this time period. So we have one constructive response question that goes with this. It's a pretty straightforward question. It says, citing specific examples, describe three of the Renaissance writers as well as what they wrote about. Well, if we look at our path to learning, we'll be able to understand. We actually have a plethora that we're going to look at here. So we're going to look at Dante, we're going to look at Petrarch, we're going to look at Boccaccio, and we're going to look at Machiavelli. So those are four more examples on top of what we learned about with Thomas More and Shakespeare in our Northern Renaissance. We actually have six writers that we can use, and the question is asking us to only talk about three. So it does give us some opportunity, some wiggle room there to answer that question. So we look at what we're going to see today. We're going to look at these four individuals and what they wrote about in the Renaissance. Well, we're going to jump right into the changes that these Renaissance writers start using. So many writers followed Dante, who wrote in the vernacular. And this was a vocab word we introduced the other day. It means native language. So a lot of writers, especially those who considered themselves very educated, and of course needed to be educated to be able to read and write, but the real educated still felt that writing in Latin and Greek were the pinnacle of language. And so, like I said, Thomas More, when he wrote Utopia, he chose to write that in Latin rather than writing in English. But that's going to start changing here in the Renaissance. So vernacular is where writers wrote in their native language rather than Greek or Latin. So we're going to start seeing a shift to that, and what's going to happen is this is going to help really solidify the English language and the German language and the Italian language, because more and more people are actually going to write in their native language like those just mentioned rather than Greek or Latin. So this could include Italian, German, English, and French, among many others, of course. We could throw Spanish in there, and you name it. So if you spoke it and wrote in it, that was your vernacular. Certainly people continued to learn other languages, but you're starting to see that shift away from writing in Greek and Latin. One of the things Renaissance writers were well known for is Renaissance writers wrote for self-expression, or to portray the individuality of their subjects. And this started several trends that modern writers still follow. You start having characters that matter. You start having characters who, kind of symbolize your plot, who you want to follow through your plot and, see to the end. I think Shakespeare is a great example of that. He's written some of the greatest characters of all time, thinking of Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth and Hamlet, if you're familiar with those works. So there's no doubt the individuality of those subjects comes through in his works. And we can make that connection certainly with many of the other writers that we're going to talk about here. So we're going to start with Dante. Dante's kind of interesting because he actually started writing more towards the tail end of the Middle Ages. And Dante is definitely Italian. Dante was a major Italian poet. Is widely considered to be one of the best Italian writers of all time. Some even say he is called the father of the Italian language. So let's look at his work, The Divine Comedy. So here we go with Dante. Dante was an Italian poet. He was a writer. He was a theorist. He was a thinker. That's what theorist means. A philosopher and political thinker. Dante wrote a lot of different things, but we're not going to focus on all of his different works. We're going to focus primarily on his work called The Divine Comedy. He was born in Florence, Italy, so we've got our connection here to the Renaissance. As mentioned, he is referred to as the father of the Italian language. because he decided to write in his vernacular. He really pioneered a lot of what Italian would eventually become. So without him, you really wouldn't have the modern Italian language as we see it today. So he wrote the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is an epic poem about Dante's travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven. Now, purgatory is an interesting one. We haven't really mentioned that yet. Purgatory is sort of that in-between place, in between heaven and hell. And many Catholics, especially during this time, believed that in order to get to heaven, you needed to spend many, many years in purgatory. It might be a few years, it might be 100 years. And the actions, the things that you could do in your natural life could actually cut down on your time in purgatory. And part of the reason I'm mentioning that here is that when we get into our second part of this unit on the Reformation, you're actually going to hear quite a bit about that. So again, Dante's epic poem was about his own travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven. It's broken up into three parts. You've got Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, which translate to hell, purgatory, and heaven, of course. There are lots of different versions of this, of course. There was a video game made for the Xbox 360 and PS3 called Dante's Inferno. Obviously, it's more of an action game than it was about being anything historically accurate. I did play it, and I enjoyed it, but I just thought it would be worth mentioning here. There's a little bit of pop culture on Dante. Our next Italian writer is a guy named Petrarch. Now, Petrarch's kind of interesting, but he's actually the guy who coined the phrase the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, is the way he described it. He meant that, compared to the classical periods of the Greeks and Romans, the Middle Ages, or what he said, the Dark Ages, really were gloomy. They weren't as brilliant intellectually as what the Greeks and Romans had. So that's where we get the term Dark Ages from, is from this guy. But that's not why we're going to talk about him. That's a little fun fact there on the side. So let's take a look at Petrarch here. Petrarch is sometimes called the father of humanism. He was definitely one of the earliest humans, and he was a poet that lived in Renaissance Italy. It's actually his rediscovery of Cicero's letters, Cicero being a previous writer, and he refound these letters, and that really is often given credit to initiating the 4th century Renaissance. So he becomes the father of humanism as a result of that. So he was a great poet, definitely was educated. He knew Latin, but he wrote in both his Italian vernacular and Latin. And one of the things we remember most about Petrarch is he wrote sonnets. Sonnets are 14-line poems, and many, many, many of his sonnets were written about this woman named Laura. And it's kind of interesting because we don't really know a lot about Laura. We do know that she died of plague in 1348, but we're not really sure if he actually ever met her. There's some people that suggest that he was in love with her. There's some people that suggest that he was just an admirer of her and never actually got to meet her. And this is where I always like to tell the guys in the room, guys, if you like a girl, go talk to her. Don't be like Petrarch, because he never married her. As far as we can tell, he never had a romantic relationship with her. At the very best, he might have just written about her from afar, which in a way almost sounds kind of creepy in the modern world. But Laura was pretty unreachable. There was very few physical descriptions about her. They're very vague, but we do know that he sort of pined over her, that he was in love with her. Here's an example of this. I'm not going to read this to you. For those of you watching it on your own device, an iPad or a Chromebook, you can certainly take the time to pause this and read Sonnet 292 about Laura and definitely see how he felt about her. Now, how does one get to be the father of humanism? Well, this really puts it into perspective. So by putting classical philosophical ideas into a Christian framework, at least that's how Francesco Petrarca, aka Petrarch did it. In the Roman Catholic Europe, many of the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome were not likely to be accepted unless they could be reconciled with the Christian faith, and Petrarch did so in his writings. So he took the classics of Greece and Rome, he added Christianity to it, and that's how he became the father of humanism. You had to have that connection to the classics. We've mentioned that this whole unit, that Greece and Rome were really the pinnacle of what the educated elite in the Renaissance looked up to. All right, we're going to end part 1 there. We have 2 more authors we want to talk about. So we have looked at Dante and Petrarch here. We're going to come back with part 2, and we're going to look at a guy named Boccaccio, and we're going to talk about Machiavelli. So go ahead and hit stop and cue up part 2.